After wrapping my head around the idea of components, the docs led me into the ideas of state and hooks. So state is a pretty foundational aspect of computing. Simply put, it's the value of a location in memory at a specific time. This memory location is represented in software as a variable. Depending on the value of the variable, the program may calculate something, display something, execute specific sections of code, branching. When the value inside one of the variables changes, the state of the program changes. In JavaScript, developers will often use local variables to save or change state. This doesn't work in React. So this was new to Jane. If you've been working in React, you don't really think about this anymore, but it is a bit unusual the way you use hooks or the class-based components to maintain state. That's definitely not the way that we used to do things in JavaScript, and not necessarily the way you do things in most programs. But this is because of how React renders. Every time that React renders, it renders the code essentially from scratch. It looks at the code that you wrote, the initialization that you gave to that variable, and says, well, I guess that's the value of this variable. Even if you have a click event that changes the variable, React will always see your local variable as its initialized value. So I think what Jane is basically saying here is that if you have a global variable, or if you change the state of a variable within a component, and by changing the state, I just mean modifying it directly, React forgets its value, right? And this isn't, this is definitely a React thing. If you use Svelte or other systems, they use I was going to say more intuitive behavior where you can just modify variables, but Svelte kind of pretends to do that, but then really underneath you have to use a bunch of special syntax, and I think there's a lot of other issues with it. But in React, you can actually use Mobex is a library that allows you to work in this more intuitive manner. But I, for various reasons, don't prefer that. So this is what Jane is actually talking about here. If we're going to get into some of the more deeper technical details, this is more coming from the world of functional reactive programming style. So React is, I would say, loosely based on this idea. If you want to learn more about it, it's a really fascinating topic, and I think it would help understand some aspects of React better. It's called functional reactive programming, and the overall idea is, instead of modifying state, you program in a more purely functional style. I think React doesn't do this quite perfectly, but that's what they're getting at. You can look at your function and you can be like, your component function, right? And you can be like, okay, given these inputs, here's what my output's going to be. And that's super valuable. That's why functional, purely functional programming style in general, in my opinion, is so powerful. And that's one of the reasons I really like React. I think the way it does state, I don't love it. I do find, I was going to say I do find it better than the alternatives. I don't know about better. I think it might often lead to better code for a lot of people because it forces you to be more explicit about state changes, which is a good thing. But yeah, if you're curious, look up functional reactive programming. This is kind of like the ideas Jane is talking about here. So Jane says changes to local variables will not trigger a render. I mean, if you've done any React, you know this by now. But this also means that even if you change the text on a button programmatically using the JavaScript APIs, it will not show up on screen. The programmer must trigger a render. And this is really Jane working through the way that React is different from more traditional programming. So I think this is really interesting. And she says this is where hooks come in. The name hook comes from the idea that a hook in React will let you hook into different React-specific features. So she first talks about the useState hook. The React developers have made a specific hook to allow users to handle state correctly. This is the aptly named useState hook. This hook provides two things: a state variable to save the value of the variable between renders, and a function to update the variable and trigger a render potentially. The beta docs have a nice little sandbox illustration to demonstrate the attempt to update a local variable and how to do it properly with the useState hook. But below that, there's this little tan box labeled pitfall. In this box, the docs state that hooks can only be called at the top level of your components, kind of like an import, although not quite that high level. This means that you can't update your state from within conditional logic. Why? The React developers decided to store the hooks within an array. They then identify each hook by its location in the array. Why? Is there no other way to uniquely identify the hooks? This seems really limited. Jane says, let's jump over to Thomas and let them explain. Yeah, so I've covered this pretty extensively in another episode. If I can, remember, I'll link to that if you're curious. But I have a lot of thoughts on this. In fact, I even did an experiment where I essentially created my own hook state system that it allowed you to use hooks within conditionals. I honestly don't know why React did it this way. I think they could have automatically done a much more intuitive implementation that would allow you to use hooks within conditionals, which I think would lead to a much more natural style of programming. I don't know. I really should, get some of the React developers on the horn here and see if I can find out, what if I'm missing something, if there's more here. But yeah, the downside is you are definitely limited on how you can use hooks. And to be honest, once you learn the style, it's not that big of a deal because you put your conditionals inside the hooks. But it's definitely a less intuitive way to program. And to me, that's not good design. That's not what I'm about. You know me, right? Like, let's have good design. Let's have intuitive behavior. I think this is definitely unintuitive. And I've had to work with a lot of engineers that get stuck or hung up on this. How do I do this without, putting this in a conditional type of thing?